The early morning fog had barely begun to lift when Zane, a seasoned human soldier, stood in his lookout post at a remote military base. The silence of the surrounding forest was broken only by the distant hum of the base's security systems, which constantly monitored the skies for any unusual activity. Zane had been stationed in this isolated location for months, and the monotony of the job had begun to wear on him. His only company was the occasional comms chatter and the rare wildlife that ventured too close to the base. That was until something unusual appeared on the radar. At first, Zane thought it was just a glitch. But as the signal grew stronger and more defined, his instincts kicked in. This was no glitch. An unidentified object, cloaked and undetectable by normal tracking systems, was heading straight for Earth. The alarms blared through the base, and the air around Zane seemed to thicken with tension. He quickly activated the base's communications, trying to reach his commander. "We've got a problem," Zane muttered under his breath. But before he could finish his sentence, the ship's trajectory shifted. It was falling fast. The object, a sleek, metallic ship, was plummeting toward the Earth. Zane's heart raced. He knew exactly what this meant. An alien ship had crash-landed. But what kind of ship? Who was inside? Within minutes, the ship made impact, exploding in a fiery blaze. The ground shook, sending tremors through the base. Zane grabbed his rifle and sprinted toward the crash site, his mind racing with 1,000 questions. Alien craft were not a common occurrence, and every human soldier had been trained for such scenarios. Yet no amount of training could prepare him for what lay ahead. As he reached the edge of the burning wreckage, Zane could make out the faint outline of a figure lying motionless among the scattered debris. The fire crackled behind her as Zane moved forward cautiously, his breath heavy with anticipation. Was it a trap? Or perhaps an injured alien desperate for help? He couldn't be sure, but he couldn't leave her there either. It was then that he saw her face, a pale, alien girl. She was covered in blood, her body twisted and broken, but her beauty was undeniable. Her silvery blue skin shimmered under the firelight, and her long dark hair was matted with ash. Zane's instincts screamed at him to act quickly. He reached down, lifting her fragile form into his arms. The heat of the fire and the urgency of the situation sharpened his focus. She was alive, but for how long? He was about to carry her back to the base when a loud crash from above interrupted him. Zane looked up, his heart racing. Dark shadows filled the sky as enemy ships, now visible, hovered ominously above. They were the ones who had been tracking her. He had no time to think. Zane gritted his teeth and ran as fast as he could, carrying the alien girl in his arms, his mind racing through all the training he had received. The enemy forces would be relentless. They wouldn't let this alien escape. But Zane couldn't just leave her to die. He had to protect her. Zane's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. He had orders to report any alien sightings immediately, to capture or neutralize threats. But something inside him, the part of him that had seen enough violence to last a lifetime, told him that this was different. He wasn't sure why he felt this way. He had never been one to question orders. But in that moment, something about the way the girl looked at him, the terror in her eyes, the vulnerability in her posture, made him hesitate. He dove into the underground tunnels beneath the military base, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what would happen next. He only knew that if he didn't hide her, they would both be dead. The tunnel was dark and damp. The only sounds the rush of his breath and the distant hum of the base's systems. Zane reached the makeshift medical bay deep underground, placing the girl carefully on one of the cots. He could hear the buzzing of the enemy ships overhead, their scanners probing the area. They were searching, and they were getting closer. Zane stood over her, unsure of what to do next. She was barely conscious, her breathing shallow, her chest rising and falling with difficulty. Her body was alien to him, her skin a strange, shimmering hue, her features unlike anything he had seen before. She seemed so fragile, Yet there was something undeniably strong about her. Was she a prisoner, a soldier, or perhaps something far more dangerous? Her lips parted slightly, and she murmured something in a language Zane didn't understand. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Fear, desperation, and pain. He had no way of communicating with her, no way of knowing whether she was a threat or an innocent bystander. And yet, despite everything, Zane couldn't bring himself to hurt her. The enemy forces were closing in on the base, their ships now positioned just outside the perimeter. The base's security systems buzzed in warning as they initiated lockdown protocols. Zane knew that within minutes they would send in ground forces to search for the alien fugitive. He had to make a decision. Should he turn her in to the authorities, or should he protect her, risking his life and his career to do so? The tension in the air was suffocating, and Zane was acutely aware of the fact that he was on the edge of making a decision that would change his life forever. The alien girl, whoever she was, had no place in this world. And yet, for some reason, he couldn't bring himself to hand her over. She had no way of defending herself. She was alone, injured, and scared. And Zane realized, with a sudden clarity, that he was the only one who could help her. With no more time to waste, he made up his mind. He would protect her, at least for now. He would keep her hidden in the underground tunnels, as long as he could, but he couldn't do it alone. He needed to get to the command center and figure out how to stop the enemy forces from getting any closer. As he moved toward the entrance of the tunnels, a loud thud echoed from above. The enemy forces had arrived. Zane's heart pounded in his chest as he moved swiftly, turning to check on the alien girl one last time before heading for the command center. He would need all the help he could get if he was going to protect her. But in the back of his mind, he knew that his decision had already set the wheels of fate in motion, and there was no turning back now. As Zane ran through the dimly lit tunnels, he couldn't help but wonder, who was this girl? What was her story? And why had she come to Earth? The answers would have to wait. For now, Zane had to survive. The days following Zane's decision to protect Lyra were filled with tension. The military base, now locked down, was under constant threat from enemy forces that scoured the area. Zane kept Lyra hidden deep within the underground tunnels, where the dim light flickered above them, casting eerie shadows against the stone walls. He had no choice but to keep her a secret, but as the days dragged on, the burden of that decision began to weigh heavily on him. Lyra, though injured, was slowly regaining her strength. Her once silent presence began to shift, revealing glimpses of the powerful being she truly was. The first sign of her extraordinary abilities came one morning, when Zane entered the tunnels to find her sitting up in bed, her eyes wide open. For a brief moment, her silver-blue skin shimmered with an ethereal glow, as though she were absorbing energy from the environment. Zane was still unsure what to make of her powers, but one thing was clear: she was not an ordinary alien. As the days passed, Zane began to observe her more closely. Lyra's mind seemed to operate on a different level. She could manipulate small objects with a flick of her fingers, making them hover and move without touching them. He had seen technology like this before, cloaking devices and telekinetic abilities, but never on a being like her. She was connected to a power far beyond anything Earth had ever encountered. But what terrified Zane most was how little control she had over these abilities. The more her powers surfaced, the more erratic and dangerous they became. One evening, as Zane was trying to teach her basic human phrases, a sudden surge of energy erupted from Lyra. A blinding flash of light filled the room, and objects around her were sent flying against the walls. Zane barely managed to duck behind a nearby pillar as the force of the blast shattered the stone walls around them. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound of his blood rushing in his ears. Lyra, looking horrified, held her hands to her head as if trying to control the surge of power. She seemed unaware of what had just happened. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to." Zane, though shaken, understood that this was more than just a random accident. The alien girl was struggling to control her powers, and if she lost control again, the consequences could be devastating. He couldn't let that happen. But what terrified him was the fact that someone else might come looking for her, someone who would want to harness that power for themselves. And soon enough, that someone did. As the days turned into weeks, Zane's worst fear became a reality. Enemy forces, a faction of human soldiers aligned with the alien hunters, were closing in. They had heard rumors about the alien girl's abilities and feared what she could do if left unchecked. They launched a covert operation to capture her, using advanced technology and superior numbers to hunt her down. Zane had no choice but to act quickly. He knew that the odds were stacked against him. He was one soldier, armed with only Earth's basic technology, and he had no backup. But one thing Zane had learned over the years was that the human spirit was not easily broken, even when faced with impossible odds. This would be a fight for survival, and he would do everything he could to protect Lara. The first attack came under the cover of night. Zane had just finished securing the tunnel entrance when the sound of footsteps echoed through the dark corridors. He rushed back to Lyra, his mind racing. He didn't know how many soldiers there were, but he knew one thing for certain. If they got to Lyra, she would be taken from him, and if they captured her, Earth would never be the same. "Stay here," Zane said, his voice steady but his pulse quickening. "Don't move. Don't make a sound." Lyra nodded, though she looked terrified. She could feel the tension in the air, and her eyes followed Zane as he moved silently through the tunnels. Zane had learned to move quickly and quietly, using his military training to navigate the complex labyrinth beneath the base. He knew these tunnels like the back of his hand. He would use every advantage he had to outsmart the soldiers hunting them. As Zane crept forward, he could hear the soldiers' voices growing louder. They were close. The enemy had split into two groups, searching for the alien girl from different directions. Zane wasn't sure how much longer he could keep her hidden, but he knew he had to act fast. Suddenly, the first group of soldiers appeared around the corner, their rifles raised and ready. Zane's heart raced as he pressed himself against the wall, holding his breath. He needed to wait for the right moment. The soldiers passed by, unaware of his presence. Zane let them get a little farther ahead before he acted. With lightning speed, he sprang from his hiding spot, taking out the first soldier with a swift punch to the jaw. The man crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Before the others could react, Zane grabbed a nearby pipe and swung it at the next soldier, knocking him off his feet. Gunfire erupted from the third soldier, the bullet narrowly missing Zane's shoulder. He ducked, narrowly avoiding the shot, and retaliated by disarming the soldier and taking him down with a well-placed kick. The fight was chaotic, but Zane's quick thinking and hand-to-hand combat training kept him in control. The soldiers were armed with advanced weaponry, but Zane had something they didn't: his resourcefulness and determination. Zane moved swiftly through the narrow corridors, using the tunnels to his advantage. His heart was pounding, but his mind was sharp. He knew he couldn't defeat them all head-on. His only chance was to use the element of surprise and outsmart them. He led the soldiers into a narrow shaft where he had set a trap, a makeshift barricade of debris that would collapse when triggered. As the soldiers pursued him, Zane activated the trap, causing the barricade to fall and block their path. The soldiers were momentarily stunned, giving Zane just enough time to make his escape. But the danger was far from over. Zane knew they would be back with reinforcements. The alien hunters wouldn't stop until they had captured Lyra, and Zane couldn't let that happen. He had to find a way to fight back, to protect her at all costs. Back at the hidden chamber, Zane found Lyra waiting anxiously. Her powers were starting to grow stronger, and the strain was evident on her face. She could feel the approaching danger, and the fear in her eyes was undeniable. Zane couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility for her. This wasn't just about survival anymore. He had to protect her, not only because she was an alien, but because she was more than that. She was someone who had no choice in what was happening to her. As the night stretched on, Zane prepared for the next wave of attacks. His mind raced, thinking of every possible strategy to outsmart the hunters and keep Lyra safe. He knew the fight ahead would be grueling. The enemy would be relentless, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. But Zane wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He would fight to the end, and he would use every weapon at his disposal to protect the alien girl who had come to Earth seeking refuge. The battle for survival had only just begun, and Zane knew that, no matter the cost, he would never abandon her. Days turned into weeks, and as the world outside continued to shift, Zane and Lyra grew closer. The tension of hiding from the enemy forces remained ever present, but within the confines of the underground tunnels, they found moments of peace. Zane had always been a soldier, trained for combat, prepared for conflict, but as he spent more time with Lyra, he started to realize just how different this situation was from any mission he'd ever encountered. This wasn't about fighting enemies or securing a victory. It was about protecting a life. Lyra, though still recovering, had begun to open up. At first, she was quiet, withdrawn, and frightened. Her mind had been clouded by the destruction of her ship, the loss of her crew, and the unknown future she now faced. But slowly, Zane saw her start to trust him. It wasn't just about the physical wounds she'd suffered in the crash. It was the emotional scars that ran deeper. Over time, as they shared more moments of silence and quiet conversation, Lyra began to reveal pieces of her past. Sitting beside a flickering light in the underground bunker one evening, Zane asked her about her home planet. She hesitated, the weight of her memories heavy in her eyes. For a long while, she didn't speak, her gaze distant, as if she were lost in a world far away. Finally, her voice broke the silence, soft and filled with sorrow. "I come from a place of honor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A place where our people valued loyalty, strength, and unity. We believed in the greater good, in serving the galaxy, and in protecting our kind. But I was betrayed. The very people I once called my family turned against me. I was framed for a crime I didn't commit, and now I'm a fugitive, running from my own kind." Zane listened intently, his heart heavy with sympathy. Lyra's eyes shimmered with a mixture of sadness and pain as she spoke, and Zane could see the weight of her past hanging over her. The betrayal she had suffered had left scars deeper than any physical wound. She had lost everything: her people, her home, her place in the world. The alien girl who had once been part of something greater was now isolated and alone. "Why would they do that?" Zane asked, his voice gentle, though he was struggling to comprehend the situation. "Why betray you?" Lyra looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. "They feared my abilities. I was born with powers that no one could understand. They thought I was a threat, and they were right to fear me. But I never wanted to harm anyone. I only wanted to help. But in their eyes, I was too dangerous. They cast me out." There was a long silence between them. Zane's heart ached for her, for the pain she had endured. The girl who had fallen from the sky, who had once been part of an advanced civilization, was now running for her life. He could see that she was struggling with something deeper, something that went beyond just survival. It was the question of identity. Could she ever return to her people? Would they ever accept her again? And if they didn't, where did that leave her? The vulnerability in her voice was something Zane hadn't expected. He had always seen her as an alien, a being from another world, whose culture and powers were beyond his understanding. But now, in that moment, she was just like him, lost, afraid, and searching for a place to belong. He didn't know the answers to her questions, but he knew one thing: he would do everything in his power to protect her. And maybe in doing so, he could give her something she hadn't had in a long time: hope. "I don't know what will happen next," Zane said quietly, his gaze meeting hers. "But I'll help you. I won't let them take you. Not while I'm here." Lyra's eyes softened, and for the first time, Zane saw something else: something that went beyond gratitude. There was a flicker of something deeper, something that mirrored his own emotions. The way she looked at him wasn't just filled with the appreciation of a woman who had been saved. It was something more, something unspoken. They shared a bond now, one that had been forged through the fire of survival and shared vulnerability. As the days passed, their relationship evolved from a mere soldier protecting a stranger to something more. Zane found himself spending more time with her, not just to keep her safe, but because he wanted to. In the quiet moments between the chaos, he began to teach her about Earth. He explained the simple things: the beauty of nature, the joy of music, and the power of human resilience. He told her about the history of his people, about the wars they had fought, and about the dreams they had for a better world. Lyra listened intently, fascinated by his stories. She had never imagined that humans were so complex, so full of hope and determination. The more she learned about Earth, the more she felt a strange sense of connection to this world, a world that was now her sanctuary. In return, Lyra shared her own knowledge of her people's technology. Zane was amazed by her explanations of cloaking devices, advanced weapons, and even psychic abilities that were far beyond Earth's current understanding. She told him stories of her home planet, a world full of beauty and intelligence, where her people had once thrived. But the more she spoke, the more Zane realized that, despite her vast knowledge, Lyra was just as lost as he was. She had lost her place in the universe, and now she was searching for a new one, just like him. One evening, as they sat beneath the stars, the tension between them shifted. They had managed to sneak outside for a brief moment of freedom, away from the claustrophobic tunnels that had become their refuge. The night sky stretched above them, vast and endless, a reminder of how small and fragile they were in the grand scheme of the universe. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. Zane stole a glance at Lyra, his eyes lingering on her. She looked different now, more human in a way. Her alien features no longer seemed as foreign to him. He saw the strength in her, the quiet resilience that mirrored his own. And despite everything that had happened, despite all the chaos and danger surrounding them, he couldn't help but feel a growing attraction to her. Lyra, too, felt it. She had never imagined that she would find warmth in a place so alien to her, in a person so different from everything she had known. Zane had been her protector, but over time, he had become something more. She admired his bravery, his unwavering dedication, and his humanity. He had saved her life, but in doing so, he had also saved something else inside her, a part of her that she thought had been lost forever. As they sat there, their shoulders gently touching, the silence between them spoke volumes. They didn't need words to understand each other anymore. The bond they shared was unspoken, but it was strong, stronger than anything they had ever known. And in that quiet moment, beneath the stars, Zane realized that what he had felt for her was no longer just a sense of duty. It was something deeper, something real. And Lyra, for the first time in a long time, allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had found a place where she truly belonged. Zane and Lyra had finally found a moment of peace. It wasn't much, a fleeting sense of safety in a world that had been turned upside down. But for the first time since Lyra's crash, they allowed themselves to believe that maybe, just maybe, there could be hope. They had grown close, shared their stories, and formed a bond that neither of them expected. It was a quiet peace, but it was theirs. However, as is often the case in a world filled with danger and deception, peace is always temporary. The betrayal came swiftly and without warning. Zane had been working closely with Bonner, his mentor, and one of the few people he trusted on the base. Bonner had been a seasoned soldier, someone who had seen it all and understood the complexities of war. He was Zane's rock in times of uncertainty, the one person Zane felt he could always count on. But it was Bonner's trust that would be shattered in the most unexpected way. Zane was in the underground tunnels, speaking to Lyra in quiet tones when he heard the distant sound of footsteps approaching. At first, He didn't think much of it. After all, the base was bustling with activity, and it was normal for soldiers to move in and out of the tunnels. But something about this moment felt different. The footsteps were too quick, too purposeful. Zane's instincts kicked in, and his hand instinctively reached for his weapon. Then the sound of the door to the tunnel opening echoed through the hall. "Zane," Bonner's voice called from the entrance. It sounded normal, calm, reassuring even. "We've got a situation. Need you to come with me." Zane hesitated, his heart racing. Something didn't feel right. Bonner had never spoken to him like this before, never demanded his presence so urgently. He exchanged a look with Lyra, who had sensed the change in his demeanor. "I'll be right back," Zane said to her, though his voice was filled with doubt. He moved cautiously towards the entrance, his hand still on the grip of his weapon. But before he could take another step, everything happened in an instant. Bonner wasn't alone. The door to the tunnel was thrown open wide, and soldiers, human soldiers, rushed in. But these soldiers were different. They weren't the ones Zane knew. Their uniforms were subtly different, and the way they moved was cold and calculated. Zane's heart dropped into his stomach. It was a trap. Bonner stepped forward, his face a mask of regret. "Zane, I didn't want it to come to this," he said, his voice low. "But I had no choice." Zane's mind raced. Bonner, his mentor, his friend, had betrayed him. He had been working with the aliens all along. And now he had led these soldiers to Lyra. The enemy knew her location, and everything they had fought for, the safety they had found, the bond they had built, was about to come crashing down. The moment Zane processed the betrayal, the storm of chaos began. The soldiers opened fire, and explosions rocked the underground tunnels. Zane barely had time to react. He lunged at Bonner, but the mentor had already turned, his expression cold and distant. The Bonner Zane knew was gone. In his place was a traitor willing to sacrifice everything for power or survival. Lyra, who had been watching from behind the barricade, now sprang into action. Her alien abilities surged within her as her psychic powers erupted in a torrent. Energy crackled around her as she wielded her technology, her alien weapons flaring with light. The soldiers who had been ready to storm the base found themselves overwhelmed by a force they could not comprehend. Lyra's telekinetic blasts sent them flying through the air, and her cloaking devices turned the tunnels into a maze of shadows. But despite her powers, Lyra was still weak from her injuries, and she couldn't fight them all at once. Zane knew they had to get out of there. Fast. "Lyra, we need to move," he shouted over the sound of gunfire. With a desperate urgency, Zane grabbed her by the arm, pulling her toward the emergency escape tunnels. But just as they turned to flee, the full force of the alien assault arrived. Waves of soldiers, more than Zane had ever expected, flooded into the base. They were armed with weapons far superior to anything Earth had ever seen. Alien technology, weapons that could disintegrate walls with a single shot, laid waste to the underground complex. Zane barely had time to process the chaos before the enemy opened fire again. He pulled Lyra down, shielding her with his body, as explosions rocked the walls around them. Every moment felt like an eternity as the two of them fought to stay alive. Zane knew that there was no way they could win this fight, not with the enemy's overwhelming numbers and superior technology. But there was no turning back now. The betrayal had set them on this path, and it was a path that would lead to a fight for survival. In the midst of the battle, Zane saw Bonner again. The traitor stood at the center of the invading force, watching from a distance as Zane and Lyra fought to hold their ground. His cold eyes locked onto Zane's, and there was no apology in his gaze, only the bitter taste of regret. Zane couldn't understand it. How could Bonner betray him like this? How could he betray someone who had once been his family? The emotional weight of it hit Zane like a wave. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about trust, about the people who were supposed to have his back, who had instead turned on him. And in that moment, Zane understood the true cost of betrayal. It wasn't just the loss of a soldier, or a mentor, or a friend. It was the loss of hope. Just then, an alien weapon fired directly at Zane and Lyra. Zane pushed Lyra to the ground, shielding her with his body as the blast hit. The force of the explosion threw him back, and he hit the ground hard. For a moment, the world went silent. He could barely breathe, the pain in his chest overwhelming. Lyra's voice cut through the fog of his consciousness. "Zane," she cried, her hands gripping his shoulders. He could feel her warmth as she held him, her alien powers reaching out to try to heal him. But Zane knew it was too late. He wasn't sure if he would survive this, but he wasn't afraid. The only thing that mattered now was protecting her. The fight raged on around them, but in that brief moment of stillness, Zane realized something. The battle wasn't just for survival, it was for something much greater. It was for the future, for the chance to rebuild. He couldn't let the betrayal destroy everything they had fought for, and he wouldn't let the sacrifice of those who had died, his mentor, Bonner, be in vain. With a final, strained breath, Zane pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the pain. He was going to fight until the last breath, because that's what humans did. They fought. They never gave up. And as the battle continued, Zane and Lyra fought together, fighting not just for survival, but for each other, and for the hope that one day they could rebuild what had been destroyed. The final battle was upon them. It had been weeks since the betrayal, and since then, Zane and Lyra had fought through every obstacle thrown their way. The stakes had never been higher, and now, the enemy was about to make their most terrifying move. Lyra's people had deployed a massive starship, an enormous warship capable of obliterating Earth with a single command. It wasn't just a military strike. It was a statement, a declaration of their power. And the world was about to feel its wrath. Zane and Lyra stood together, the weight of the mission ahead of them settling heavily on their shoulders. There was no more time for hesitation. If they failed, Earth would be lost. The starship was already on its way, its engines burning brightly in the sky as it moved closer to its target. The countdown had begun. Soon, Earth would be a pile of rubble, wiped out by the alien forces. But Lyra wasn't ready to give up on the planet she had come to love. She had learned so much about Earth, about its people, and about Zane. She had been an outcast in her own world, a fugitive. But now she had a new purpose, one that involved saving the very planet that had given her refuge. Her alien abilities had grown exponentially since she had crash-landed on Earth. The strange technology embedded within her was starting to work in harmony with her psychic powers, giving her strength she hadn't known she had. With Zane by her side, she had learned to harness her powers, but this mission would be unlike anything they had faced before. To stop the starship from destroying Earth, they would have to infiltrate the vessel itself. They would need to sabotage its weapon systems, destroy its communication networks, and stop the orbital bombardment that would rain down on Earth. Zane and Lyra prepared for the mission, working quickly to gather the necessary tools. Their plan was simple: infiltrate the enemy ship, sabotage its systems, and escape before they were caught. The hardest part: they had to do it without being detected. They would use Lyra's cloaking technology to sneak aboard the vessel, but they only had one chance. If they failed, the entire planet would pay the price. They made their way to the launch site, where a small, specially equipped shuttle awaited them. The shuttle was small enough to avoid detection, and it was equipped with cloaking devices that would keep them hidden from the ship's sensors. They climbed inside, ready for what lay ahead. Zane looked over at Lyra, her face tense, but determined. He reached out and squeezed her hand. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. Lyra nodded. "I have to be." The shuttle's engines roared to life as they lifted off the ground. The sky above them was dark, with only the faintest glimmer of stars in the distance. The enormous alien ship loomed in the distance, its massive form threatening to blot out the sky. Zane's heart raced as they approached. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. As they neared the starship, the cloaking device activated, making the shuttle disappear from the enemy sensors. They passed unnoticed into the shadows of the starship, their small craft gliding silently toward its surface. The ship was a fortress, its hull lined with armored plating and advanced defense systems. It was nearly indestructible, but that didn't matter now. They had a job to do. Zane and Lyra boarded the ship through a small access hatch that led them into the ship's maintenance tunnels. From there, they moved cautiously, making their way toward the heart of the starship. The corridors were eerily quiet, and the only sounds they could hear were their footsteps echoing against the metal floors. The ship's internal systems hummed softly, its engines thrumming as it made its way toward Earth. They encountered their first challenge almost immediately, a group of robotic guards patrolling the hallways. These were no ordinary robots. They were equipped with advanced weaponry and reinforced armor, designed to keep intruders at bay. Zane motioned for Lyra to stay low, and they ducked into the shadows. They couldn't afford to get caught this early. They waited as the robots passed by, holding their breath as the metallic feet clattered on the floors above them. The robot's sensors swept the area, but they didn't notice the hidden humans. Once the coast was clear, they continued on, moving deeper into the ship. The air was thick with tension. They knew they didn't have much time. The starship's orbital bombardment was only moments away from beginning, and the clock was ticking. The next obstacle was the ship's advanced AI system. It controlled the starship's weapons, navigation, and security. Zane and Lyra had to find a way to bypass it if they were going to stop the bombardment. But the AI was smart, and its security protocols were nearly impossible to crack. Lyra, however, had an advantage. Her alien technology allowed her to interface with the ship's systems, giving her the ability to hack into the AI and gain control. They reached the control room, a massive chamber filled with holographic displays and alien consoles. The AI was operating everything, and it was only a matter of time before it discovered their presence. Zane and Lyra moved quickly, trying to access the central control panel. Lyra placed her hand on the nearest console, her fingers glowing with energy as she interfaced with the ship's systems. "Can you do it?" Zane asked, his voice tight with urgency. "I have to," Lyra replied, her voice strained as she concentrated. The room was bathed in the soft glow of her powers as she connected to the ship's network. "I'm in, but the AI will know we're here soon." The countdown to the orbital bombardment had already begun. The ship's weapons systems were primed, ready to fire. Earth's destruction was imminent. Lyra worked quickly, her powers clashing with the alien eye. She fought to gain control of the system, pushing her abilities to their limits. Sweat beaded on her forehead as the AI fought back, its defense systems activating to try to expel her from the ship's network. Zane stood by her, his gun ready in case they were attacked. He knew the risks. If Lyra couldn't stop the countdown, the consequences would be catastrophic. Just as the countdown hit 0, Lyra made her choice. She pressed a final command, her powers surging through the ship's systems. The AI screeched in protest as it was overridden, its systems shut down by Lyra's psychic powers. The countdown halted, and the ship's weapons powered down. But the victory came at a cost. Lyra was drained, her energy almost completely depleted from the intense effort of stopping the bombardment. Her body trembled, and she collapsed into Zane's arms. "We did it," she whispered, her voice weak. Zane held her tightly, relief flooding through him. They had saved Earth, but it had come at a terrible price. Lyra had risked everything to stop the destruction of the planet, and Zane knew that the battle wasn't over. The alien forces were still out there, and there was still much to do. But for now, they had won. And in that moment, Zane and Lyra knew that their bond had become unbreakable. Together, they had defeated the odds and saved a world they both had come to love. The stars were silent above them, as if holding their breath. The battlefield had fallen quiet after the storm. It had been a battle unlike any other, one that stretched the limits of everything they knew. But now, As Zane and Lyra stood together, victorious, the weight of the fight had begun to settle in. Earth had been saved, and the alien forces had retreated, their massive starships disappearing into the vastness of space. It had been a win, but it was hard to shake the feeling that this was just one battle in a much larger war. Zane looked over at Lyra, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and disbelief. She had been the key to their victory. Her alien technology, her psychic powers, and her bravery had changed the tide of the war. But it hadn't just been her strength that had won the day. It was the combination of their efforts, their partnership, that had proven unstoppable. They had fought side by side, using Earth's technology to outsmart a much more advanced enemy. And now, they stood as the last line of defense, the survivors of a battle that had seemed impossible to win. Lyra, too, was looking at Zane, though her gaze was softer, filled with gratitude. She had come to Earth as a fugitive, a stranger in a strange land. She had never expected to find allies, let alone a human who would risk everything to protect her. But in Zane, she had found not just a protector but a friend, someone who had stood by her when no one else would. They had forged a bond that had transcended the stars, something that could never be broken. The earth beneath them seemed to breathe a sigh of relief as the alien fleet retreated. The battle had been fierce, with each side pushing their limits. But in the end, the humans had shown their resilience. Despite being technologically inferior, they had outsmarted the aliens at every turn, using their resourcefulness and determination to overcome overwhelming odds. The victory had been earned, but it had come at a great cost. Lives had been lost, and the scars of war would never truly fade. Yet in that moment, Zane and Lyra knew they had accomplished the impossible. As the dust settled, Zane turned to Lyra, his voice soft. "We did it. We actually did it." Lyra smiled faintly, her tired eyes reflecting the same disbelief. "Yes, we did. I never thought it would be possible. But here we are." They had won, but it wasn't just the defeat of the alien fleet that marked the end of this battle. It was the understanding that they had changed something far deeper, something more significant. Humans and aliens had been at odds for centuries. But in the end, it wasn't advanced technology that won the day. It was humanity's resilience, its determination to protect what mattered most, that had triumphed. But there was more to their victory than just the battle itself. The war might have been won for now, but the future still held dangers. The aliens had retreated, but they would not stay gone forever. Earth had become a symbol of resistance, and the humans had proven they were not a race to be underestimated. As Zane looked at the horizon, he knew that the war was far from over. But it didn't matter. With Lyra by his side, they would face whatever came next together. Lyra's hand found Zane's, and she gave it a gentle squeeze. It wasn't just a gesture of gratitude, it was a promise. They had been through the fire together, and they would continue to face the future together. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They were no longer just an alien and a human. They were partners, equals. Together, they had forged a bond that transcended the boundaries of their worlds. "I don't know what happens next," Lyra admitted softly, her voice barely a whisper. "But I know one thing. I want to face it with you." Zane's heart swelled. He had always been a soldier, always fighting for a cause, but this was different. This was personal. And in that moment, he knew that Lyra had become more than just an ally. She had become someone he couldn't imagine his life without. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice steady. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. You and me." They stood there for a long moment, taking in the world around them. The stars above them were still, their quiet glow reminding them that the universe was vast and full of unknowns. But for the first time in a long time, Zane felt a sense of peace. They had won. The Earth had been saved. But more than that, they had found something that neither of them had expected. A connection that was stronger than the threats they had faced. As the night continued to stretch out before them, Zane and Lyra knew that the road ahead would be difficult. The galaxy was a dangerous place, and there were enemies out there who would stop at nothing to see them fall. But they had something no one could take from them: their bond. They had proven that no matter how overwhelming the odds, no matter how advanced the enemy, they could survive and thrive together. For Zane, the future was no longer about just surviving. It was about living. And with Lyra by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. He had found a new family in this alien girl, and together they would carve out a place for themselves in a universe that had once seemed so vast and indifferent. The next chapter of their story had just begun, but one thing was certain: they would face it together, hand in hand, ready for whatever came next. Earth had won, and so had they.